Are you struggling with the new buyer broker agreement when the seller doesn't offer to pay the buyer side commission? If you are, stay tuned and we'll tell you how to get around that coming up next. Hey, it's Yama. Welcome to the Section 8 Sensei. Today we're going to talk about how to protect your commissions in those events where the seller doesn't pay them. And how to still get paid during the process. Before we get started, please subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, and stay tuned for industry information like this to try to help you stay profitable, whether you're on the buyer side, the seller side, or the real estate side. Hey guys, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this piece of it, but this whole video is based on the deadline that's coming up on August 17th, which basically has to do with the $418 million settlement through NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors. If you're not familiar with it, you can Google it or check out the other video that we did on it. It's pretty in-depth. And so this really surrounds the new policies and procedures that most brokers and agents are trying to put into place. Some of them have started already, but they definitely have to start on August 17th. Having to do with what's called a buyer broker agreement. And what that is if you haven't been following and have been living under a shell, basically what's happened is there was a lawsuit in the spring that went down, and it basically said, hey, the seller is no longer responsible to pay the real estate commission on both sides, meaning the buyer and the seller side commission, which has always been embedded into the listing agreement since the beginning of time when the first caveman bought a cave. All right. So that got busted up. So now they can still pay it, but it's not wrapped in the agreement automatically anymore. And it's been taken out of MLS. That was basically the big deal. So the antitrust suit, it was a biggie. So basically now, if you're going to buy a property, or if you're the real estate agent and you have a repping a buyer, you're going to want to negotiate this buyer broker agreement up front to say, hey, I'm going to take you out, show you all these great houses. We're going to find one, yada, yada, yada. My number is 3% of the sales price. So if you buy a $200,000 house, you got to pay me $6,000. All right. Now, because that conversation is not a given anymore, obviously there's some chatter in the marketplace that this could drop real estate commissions by 25 to 50%, et cetera, et cetera. Now, whether that happens or not, we don't know. Only time will tell, but it's definitely a conversation that obviously everybody's going to have and is going to allow for at least a little bit of dialogue in whatever sense that happens. And then we'll see kind of where it goes from there. All right, so I kind of labeled this slide word on the street, just meaning just some chatter that I've heard here and there, different people from different states saying different things, things you read online, whatever. I mean, some of it is not really applicable or even possible. But at the end of the day, it was just a couple of things I thought would be worth noting. And as we go through this, so I read one thing where basically we're saying, hey, what if buyer's agents now double dip? So, 99% of the world is saying commissions are going to hit the floor and get cut in half and all this other stuff. Everybody's going to quit and yada, yada, yada. And then I read this one thing where it's basically like, hey, well, what if the buyer's agent negotiates a 3% deal on their, on their buyer broker agreement, and then they call, when they go to put the deal together and the listing agent's offering 4% or something, could they technically double dip and get the extra money and all that other stuff? So the answer is no, because the buyer broker agreement is the law. So it's kind of basically saying, hey, this is my ceiling number. And really, like I said in the other video, I mean, the DOJ, is my understanding, is taking a look at that because they don't want, hey, let's just put 3% on there and then we'll just negotiate it down to 1 if it doesn't work out or whatever. I heard they were going to look at that. I don't know if they did or will, but that's something else to kind of keep in mind, that number that is created there is really supposed to be kind of the number that you go on. I heard the other day, hey, some states are just saying, hey, if the house is 300,000 and my number is 3%, let's just offer 309,000. All right, well, you'd have to get a lot of people on board with that, because moving the sales price up in that direct of a manner also would have to affect the appraisal, which, the house would have to appraise. Now, if you're doing a $250,000 deal, could you get, 7,500? Probably. But if you're doing a $2 million dollar deal, are you going to get another, pile out of that? I don't know, maybe. So, it's all stuff. And that kind of wraps together what we're going to talk about today. But, I think it's too direct, and I think we're all going to end up at the same place. But I think some people are trying to go about it in a way that they may end up at the right place, but it's going to be purely by accident. So I'm going to kind of explain that to you as we go on. Okay. And then I had one thing. Hey, we'll just add it into the buyer's mortgage. All right. Whoever said that's an idiot, because you can't do that. Okay. All right. Perfect. So these are the word on the street things, just some high flyers off the internet. So just wanted to cover them because I thought they were kind of funny. Okay, so how many of you guys, I mean, you could be the buyer's agent or the buyer in this case, because it really affects both, but how many of you guys have actually had a transaction go where you had a seller that was not willing to pay the buyer broker commission, and what did you do about it? Very curious to see kind of what happened. I've heard a lot of stories that go from all sides of the spectrum. So leave me a comment below and just let me know, have you actually had that happen to you in a transaction? And if it did, what did you actually do about it? All right, so let's start focusing on what the answer is and how do we fix all this crap when it goes sideways. Okay, so the first thing is, and this is on the buyer or the realtor side. It doesn't really matter. So first thing you got to do is you got to negotiate this buyer broker commission and figure out what it is you're talking about in the first place. So every agent has a different determination of what their valuation is. Every buyer has a different perspective on what that value is as well. So when you come to an agreement on whatever it is, you're going to put that on the buyer broker agreement. And then that's the number that we're trying to get, that you don't have to come out of pocket. Now, at the end of the day, okay, if you put this number into this, even in the old days, right, before all this crap happened, I mean, if you put it into the price of the house and the seller was paying it, it made the price of the house more expensive, right? The key is that the buyer never really had an opportunity to eliminate the buyer broker commission out of the contract anyway. So it was just, that's why they always, buyers, agents have always said, oh yeah, I'm going to show you all these houses and my services are free. Well, they weren't free. They just were already embedded in the price of the house at whatever the number was that the seller was offering. So, so the first thing you got to do is you got to negotiate this number, whether it's 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever the number is, establish that. Okay. Then you have to assess, once you figure out, okay, our number's 3, let's say in this example, what is it that the seller is willing to pay? So this number is no longer an MLS, but it's a phone call away. Okay, so anytime you see a property that you're interested in, if there's an agent on the other side, you just pick up the phone and call. They will tell you, okay, hey, the seller is paying 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever the number is, and now you know what they're paying. Okay, so the hope is for everybody that the number they're paying is at or larger than the number that you're being charged or that you're charging if you're an agent. Okay, all right, so that's the hope, but that doesn't always happen. Okay. Then the third thing that needs to establish is, does your buyer, or do you as the buyer, need concessions in your transaction? Okay. Meaning, do you need the seller to participate in paying some costs on your behalf, which usually results in a higher sales price? Okay. But that's okay. And, do you need those? And if you do, how much do you need? Because obviously this whole thing is being put together. Now, I would also suggest that you get with a lender who understands math, because this whole thing all kind of works together in synergy, okay, between the buyer, the agent, and the lender, okay? You can't have 3 idiots working together. It's not going to work very well, okay? So make sure that you have a good lender partner. Obviously, I understand math. You guys are figuring that out. But, the structure of what you're putting together is going to be hugely important on whether you get past the finish line and come out the other side with the amount of money that you think you're supposed to come out with. So make sure you address those 3 things, and then that's kind of the starting point for where we're going to go. All right, so moving forward to the next deal here, which is, okay, so all that's good. I have a baseline. I kind of know what the problem is, and I now know what it is I don't know. And now we're going to move on to what is the actual solution. So what are we going to do with this data that we just got? We now know my guy needs concessions. We now know that I've got a 3% buyer broker agreement, right? And we now know that the seller is paying X. So we know if there's a deficiency, so to speak. Okay. The next step we got to go to is, what is the max seller concession on the loan? So depending on what kind of financing you have in place is going to vary is going to change your seller concession number. So if you're doing a 3% down conventional, you have a max 3% seller concession limit. If you are doing an FHA loan, you got 6. If you're doing a conventional, at 80 to 90 LTV, you're at 6. So whatever your number is, you got to find out what your concession limit is, because you're always going to have to operate within that anyway. That's no matter whether this happened or didn't happen, that's always going to be a thing. Okay. All right. So you got to figure out what is the max seller concession on the loan going to allow. And then we also have to take a look at how much does the buyer need in concessions. So we knew that they needed them. Now we got to figure out how much. Okay. And this is going to be either in a flat dollar amount, which is then going to equate into a percentage or a basis point number. So you buy a $300,000 house, you're asking for 2% in concessions, you're going to ask for $6,000. Is that going to be enough to do everything you got to do? Okay. All right. And then obviously, like we said before, how much of the buyer side commission is the seller willing to pay? So we now know if there's that deficiency. Okay. So once we have these things, now we start to develop, okay, what's our solution going to be and how are we going to present this to get it by and get our contract approved? All right. So now we are going to start cooking with gas. All right, here we go. All right. If your buyer broker agreement is even up, right, and they're willing to pay what you're willing to ask for, then there's not really a problem. Okay. So the problem comes in when the seller goes, hey, I'm paying less, or I'm not paying anything. That's where the challenge has been in recent, all the way to I think I told the story in the other video where I had one agent that the seller just absolutely refused to pay anything classified as buyer side broker commission, and she ended up working for free. Okay, so we don't want that to happen. That's not right. I don't care if you're a buyer that's happy about it or not. That's not right. And then you got to sue the buyer to get the money. I mean, it's just a hot mess. So we don't want to go down that road if we can help it, and we just want to structure a deal that's sound and that will get approved. Okay, so if you are in a situation where the buyer broker percentage is less than what the seller was willing to pay, so let's just say in our example, you had a 3% buyer broker agreement, but let's say that the listing side is only willing to pay 2%. So now you're short. So conventional wisdom says, okay, well, Mr. Buyer, we're buying a $300,000 house. They're only going to pay $6,000. My number's $9,000. So now your buyer, who already needs concessions, which means they sure as hell don't have your other $3,000. You're now basically saying to them, hey, you got to stroke me a check for $3 after we close on this transaction. All right, well, that's not happening. And if you sue the buyer, then you're obviously not going to have a repeat client ever in your life. So all of these things are bad. Okay, so here's the solution. We take the shortage and we add it on top of your concession request from the buyer. Okay, all of you guys are like, wait a second, you just told me we have a limit. Okay, that's true. But listen to what I'm saying. All right, so let's say we have a 1% gap. We have a $300,000 deal, so we're short $3,000. Okay, so we're basically in a situation where we need to get concessions for the buyer to do their thing, and then we need to get some concessions to pay our shortage of commission, so nobody, is suing anybody for the money. All right, so we're going to add that to the concession request. So if in our example, hey, I needed 2% or $6,000 towards the buyer's closing costs so that they could pay their closing costs, prepaids, impounds, whatever, we're now going to add $3,000 to that request. So we're going to ask for 3% in concessions, okay? Not real estate commission or buyer broker commission. We're going to ask for 3% in concessions for the buyer, okay? So let me say that again. We're going to ask for 3% in concessions for the buyer for their costs. We're not going to ask, and you're only going to ask for 2% on your real estate commission number because that's all they were willing to pay. All right. So what I'm telling you is that your additional concessions can be added on top of the buyer's max, okay, for the loan program. All right. So let's kind of run through this example. Let's say that you have a 3% down conventional loan. It's got a 3% concession max because he's doing a 97% home ready or whatever, right? 3% seller concession max, which is, let's say in our example, $9,000. Okay. All right. Let's say that you had 3% buyer broker. They were only paying 2. So now you really need 12 grand, right? 9,000 for the buyer and 3,000 extra for the agent to pay the money. Okay. So this is just assuming we had 9,000 in costs. All right. Okay. So now we're technically asking for 4%. So we're over the 3% limit, right? So that's what everybody's thinking. Okay. So what I'm telling you is, and we're going to kind of go through how this works, that if you ask for 4% in that scenario and there's a 3% limit on the program, that will work. All right, so here is that example that we just went through again on paper, okay, as far as the slide goes, okay? So we're talking 3% buyer broker agreement, and obviously you guys can change these numbers to whatever the hell you want to make them, okay? But you got to understand the concept first, okay? So let's say you had the 3%, and let's say agent calls up, they say, hey, you know what, my seller's only willing to pay 2%. That's it. Okay, well, we can swim upstream and try to beat the seller over the head to pay the 3. Okay, you can do that if you want. But they obviously came up with a 2% number for a reason. And so we just don't know if we're talking to somebody that's steadfast, you know, this is my number, or that's just some number they threw out there and they're negotiable. But regardless, you can play it any way you want, but here's going to be the answer at the end of the day. All right. So let's say that they give you a number that's short. You now are short the 1%. Now we're now asking for the buyer concession, like we said. The max was 3%. Okay. But we now have a contract asking for 4. Okay. So those are kind of the numbers that we just talked about. And then we're going to show you kind of why this is okay. Okay. So the reason that this works is because when this first came out, there was a lot of concern about the seller concession limits that are built into the loan programs, right? Because if this becomes a buyer side cost, does this buyer side cost get now equated into the max seller concession of the loan program? Okay, so that was my biggest concern, which, hey, if you got a 3% buyer broker agreement and we got a 97 LTV loan with a 3% concession max, and the 3% in concessions is going to pay your real estate money, this deal's never going to close because this person doesn't have enough money, right? So that was obviously the concern out of the gate. So the reason that this has shifted a little bit is because all the agencies that came out, Fannie, Freddie, which is conventional, FHA, VA, and USDA, and everybody else, basically have all said, hey, look, if this becomes a buyer side cost, we are not going to look at it as a buyer cost that factors into the seller concession numbers. Now, VA was interesting because VA strictly prohibits the buyer from paying real estate commission. I mean, that's like in their guides. So they actually came out and said, hey, we're going to give you a little waiver on this puppy and we're going to exclude the number. So the reason that some of this is going on, and I'm going to show you the kind of the mathematics part of it in a sec, but the reason that it works is because all the agencies have excluded whether it's in the contract or not, whether it's a buyer side, buyer's writing a check, whatever is happening, they're excluding that from our normal formula for lending. And that has helped us out a lot to be able to kind of manipulate the numbers and make these things work. All right, so this is kind of cool. So check this out. So in our software program, okay, so this is what's called an LOS or a loan origination system. Okay, so in our software program, you can kind of see on line 704, I think it is. There's a spot for real estate commission, and that slot is specifically there because it excludes that line of cost from our points and fees test and our seller concession limits. Okay, so points and fees test, meaning there can only be so many points or percentage of loan amount and fees against the loan amount number in order to pass this compliance test. So obviously seller concessions are the same thing. So that line 704 specifically omits that from the calculation. So that's where, let's say that there was a buyer side cost and they in fact had to pay it, right? Or or you were getting over the concession limit to pay that number. the system will mathematically back it out so that you still meet the 3% and it knows 1% is going to pay this other fee, which isn't in the calculation to begin with. So that's how the thing is set up on our side of the fence. But, once you kind of understand that part of it, it starts to make a little bit more sense on how to attack this thing, moving forward. All right, so I know that was a lot for most of you guys, but here's the moral of the story, okay? The moral of the story is this. At the end of the day, whatever your buyer-broker agreement says, even in your worst-case scenario where the seller comes out and they say, hey, we're not paying anything, okay? We're paying zero on the buyer-side broker deal, and you're short 3%. You could go out and tack that on top of your concession request, on top of, and that can exceed basically your seller concession match for the loan program on top of it. So even if you said, hey, look, I'm doing a 97 conventional loan, 3% concession max, I'm going to go out. The seller says they're not paying shit on this thing. And so I don't want to get screwed. I don't want to sue my buyer. I don't want any of that. So I'm going to just go into this loan and ask for 6% in seller concessions. Okay. Now, you don't have to disclose what the 6 is for. They can ask, but you don't have to tell them anything. At the end of the day, for the seller, it's about net proceeds. Okay. What that means is that if I sell a house for $100,000 and you ask me for 3% in buyer broker commission and 3% in seller concessions, I'm going to net $94,000. If I go out and I say, hey, I'm going to sell the same $100,000 house and you're going to ask for 6% in seller concessions, I'm still netting $94,000. It makes no difference to me. Call it tomato, call it tomato. It's just a shell game. So you can always ask for more under that premise. So don't ever think that if you can't convince the seller to pay the quote unquote, buyer broker commission, it doesn't frickin' matter. Just call it something else, go get the money, and we'll reroute it after the fact. Hopefully that makes sense. If you guys have questions, hit me up. My information is in the description below. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Turn on your notifications because we'll bring you all sorts of stuff like this in creative financing to try to make sure everybody gets paid, gets in their house, has a good transaction, and more importantly, that we can close and move down the road. So we'll see you next time. Feel free to reach out. Like I said, I know it was kind of complicated, so apologize for that, but it's really pretty simple. And the last couple sentences kind of tell the tale. All right, we'll see you next time.